So the context for today's reflection is on the priesthood, but we're moving towards the whole process of cultivating unity, which would be the focus of the convocation of 2018. So on December the 7th, 1965, Pope Paul VI promulgated the decree on the ministry and life of priests, which was titled Presbyterorum Ordinis. And the decree was written to treat the subject of priests at greater length and with more depth. In chapter 2 of the decree, the union of priests with their bishops is addressed, and it says this: this union of priests with their bishops is all the more necessary today, since in our present age, for various reasons, apostolic undertakings must necessarily not only take on many forms, but frequently extend even beyond the boundaries of one parish or diocese. No priest, therefore, can on his own accomplish his mission in a satisfactory way. He can do so only by joining forces with other priests under the direction of the bishop. Priests, by virtue of their ordination to the priesthood, are united among themselves in an intimate sacramental bond, a brotherhood. In individual dioceses, priests from one priesthood under their own bishop, they form this unity, and in a sense, it's already in the decree that we cultivate among ourselves this sense of unity. Even those priests are assigned to different duties, nevertheless, they carry on one priestly ministry. All indeed are united in the building up of the body of Christ, which, especially in our times, requires manifold duties and new methods. It is very important that all priests, whether diocesan or religious, help one another always to be fellow workers in the truth. Each one, therefore, is united in special bonds of apostolic charity, ministry, and brotherhood with the other members of the priesthood. Each and every priest, therefore, is united with his fellow priests in a bond of charity, prayer, and total cooperation. In this manner, they manifest that unity which Christ willed, namely, that his own be perfected in one, so that the world might know that the Son was sent by the Father. In that context, we've invited Father Stephen Joseph Victor from the esteemed Archdiocese of Newark. We are so happy to have you here, and you will only get paid after you've given an outstanding presentation, which I know you will. We were happy to have you here, of course, and Father Stephen is one of the authors of this book here. It's called Same Call, Different Men, The Evolution of the Priesthood Since Vatican II. And matter of fact, this study began back in 1965 in light of this decree. And Father Stephen, as I said, is a priest of the Archdiocese of Newark. He is the newly appointed pastor of St. Elizabeth Parish in Wyckoff, New Jersey. And I know that, I think you told me that your parish is 11,000 people. And we're just happy that you're here, even though you left all that work behind. Father Stephen is also part of the CARA, and the CARA is the Applied Research in the Apostolate, a Catholic social science research center based in Washington, D.C., that conducted the study on which this book is based, and the many previous studies of our priesthood over the decades since Vatican II. Same Call, Different Men acknowledges that the world and the church in which priests minister today may be physically different than it was in 1965, but the priesthood still is relevant, critical to the life of the church, and from what I see, a source of joy and grace. So let's welcome, with a nice round of applause, Father Stephen, who will begin to reflect more deeply on the same call, different men, and what the priesthood looks like in the 21st century. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Father Warren, and it is my honor to be with all of you today. Can I also use this microphone? Sure. Do I have to be here? I like to walk around a little bit more. Well, actually, this doesn't look like it comes out. There it goes. One second.
That microphone only goes to the camera. It doesn't.
Oh, it only goes to the camera. Okay, so I'm stuck with this one here. All right, I'm the type of person who likes to walk around all over the place. So anyway, I'm happy to be with all of you today, and I would like to start off by saying I feel very much at home, even though I grew up right outside of New York City, and I've been doing most of my priesthood in northern New Jersey. I have been, since I was a young boy, a Red Sox fan. And so every summer I make my pilgrimage to Fenway, and I was actually at the final game, the 6th game against the Cardinals. A friend of mine from up in, where is he from, Bedford, got me tickets to go to the final game where we beat the Cardinals. And that was, I have to say, almost like a religious experience, being in Fenway, winning that. And people often ask why I'm a Red Sox fan, growing up right outside of New York City and having taught at Fordham University, which is right near Yankee Stadium. It's very simple. I'm one of 4 children. My older brother and I used to fight every single day of our lives. He was a Yankee fan, so by default, I became a Red Sox fan. So I'm very grateful for that. But anyway, all kidding aside, the topic that I'm presenting on you today is about the most current research that exists on the priesthood in America today. And actually, it's the 5th wave of a longitudinal study that goes back over 50 years. Right now, we at CARA, the Center for Applied Research and the Apostolate down at Georgetown, we're about to launch the 6th wave of this study. So it's a bit of a family affair. I don't know if any of you would be old enough to remember, but my granduncle, my grandfather's brother, was the first Catholic priest to hold a chair at Harvard University. So that was in 1965 to 1970. His name was Joseph Victor. Obviously, I got the Joseph as my middle name in his honor. But Uncle Joe was, well, depending what side of the fence you're on, he was either a famous Jesuit or an infamous Jesuit, depending on where you look at things. But Uncle Joe wrote 32 books in his lifetime, and he was the forerunner in the whole field of sociology of religion. And no, I am not a Jesuit. I am a diocesan priest. I had been with the Legionaries for 14 years. I was the vice rector of their seminary, and then I was their chief financial officer, and then one of the whistleblowers against the founder, Father Maciel. That's a whole nother topic for another time, but an unpleasant chapter of life. But it brought me back to the United States when I decided to leave the Legionaries. I was going to go back to my home diocese, which is the Archdiocese of Newark, and I've been there now for 17 years, and as Father Warren just said, just became the pastor of one of our mega parishes with 11,000 parishioners, which is really crazy, coming from a parish that only had 2,200 or whatever. So, but I do divide my time between doing a lot of work for different dioceses around the country, but I'm also, my primary ministry is the parish ministry. I'm blessed to have 2 young, newly ordained priests that are with me in the parish. So when I'm away, we're giving them that opportunity to flourish and grow in many different ways. It's a little bit of background on that. But my uncle, as I said, was the first sociologist, the first priest to ever do a survey on priests. And when he did that back in the 1960s, it was very interesting because this is prior to Vatican II, and the bishops at that time said, well, what does it matter what the priests think? What does it matter what the priests feel? They should just do what they're told, right? Just obey and go do your mission. And they didn't really understand the value that psychology or anthropology or sociology or any of the other human sciences could add to our understanding of the priesthood. And then obviously Vatican II happened, and there's a greater understanding that we can learn so much from there. So as my uncle's career progressed, it was very interesting because then the bishops asked him to be on the ad hoc committee that then launched their own study on the priesthood in early 1970s. So at the beginning, they were telling him they didn't want him to be doing any surveys of priests, and actually had a cardinal at the Vatican try to shut him down because of trying to do these surveys. But then the bishops themselves realized how incredibly useful this type of information is, to get a real feel of where priests are and how as bishops, right, they can better serve us in our ministry. So he went on to do that. And so in 1970, the United States Bishops' Conference, then the NCCB, it wasn't the USCCB just yet, they paid for this study, a huge, massive study that set the groundwork for everything I'm going to present to you today. And as sociologists, besides being priests, as sociologists, what we really love, we love longitudinal studies. We love to ask the same question over time to people to see how things are really evolving and changing. So you're going to have to give me a second here. I have to kind of go back and forth. But so the book that we're going to talk about today, as Father Warren mentioned, is Same Call, Different Men, The Evolution of the Priesthood. Do any of you have problems sleeping at night? No? Anyone do? Because all three of my siblings have told me this is a perfect cure for insomnia. So, but I'm very proud of the book. It's a wonderful book that I wrote with Mary Gautier and Paul Pearl, and it was my first book. Then I did my own solo book, and then I just finished a third one on the bishops just now that will be coming out Easter of next year. But this was financed by the National Federation of Priests Council. They're the ones that got the grant. At CARA, we don't even know who provided the grant. It was an anonymous donation that was there. And then we at CARA constructed the survey. But I'll give you a little bit more of the background history on that. I did bring 3 copies with me, so if anyone was interested, I have 3 copies here, and I can give them to you afterwards if you're interested. So as I mentioned, this book is the 5th wave of this study. The study began in 1970 when the Bishops' Conference commissioned this. And if you want to put it into the context of the church in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Were any of you ordained at that time? Hands up. Okay, so you guys will remember that, all right? I'm sure at least a quarter of your class left the priesthood. At least a quarter of your class, right? What we found of that generation, by that time that generation got to its 25th anniversary, literally 1/4, 25% of them had already left the priesthood. So it was right in the wake of Vatican II, a lot of confusion, nuns were leaving the convent, priests were leaving, and the bishops realized that there's something radical that's going on. There was a major, major concern of that the priesthood was going through this seismic shift, and they wanted to discover what the priests were actually thinking. So they asked them a whole bunch of questions about what made them satisfied or dissatisfied, what were their motivations, what were their problems. And interestingly enough, if you ever want to go back to the book, it's a big, thick book like this, they actually interviewed not only the priests, but also bishops. They also interviewed major superiors of religious orders and religious order priests, and they interviewed recently, defrocked priest or priest who had recently left the ministry. And they really wanted to get a good feel of what was happening. It was such a tumultuous time. They wanted to find out what was going on. And so Father Andrew Greeley, may he rest in peace, the kind of famous, or again, infamous author, the way you want to look at him. You may not like his novels, but his research as a sociologist were really top-notch. So he wrote this book, finally it was published in 1972, but all the data was based on that. Then 15 years later, in 1985, Dean Hoagie decided to do a follow-up study on the 1970 thing. Because he realized 15 years have passed, that whole massive exodus that happened in the late 60s, early 70s had definitely subsided. I entered the seminary myself in 1985. It was a time where from that point forward, we've had a major stabilization in terms of number of seminarians, in terms of numbers of ordinations. It's been pretty consistent. You're going to see why there's a bigger problem, because as earlier generations were so numerous, and we're really depending on them now as our retired priests helping us out. But as they're passing on to their eternal reward, it's leaving a lot of gaps in the priesthood, which I imagine your diocese has experienced a lot of these different gaps, which I'm going to get into. But Dean Hoagie, which is kind of another neat thing, when he was doing his graduate work at Harvard, my uncle was actually his dissertation director. And then it was actually Dean Hoagie in the year 2000 that inspired me eventually to get my own doctorate in sociology and continue in this path. But anyway, so Dean did this in 1985, replicated the study, and then he decided every 8 years after that, he was going to do another wave and another wave and another wave of this particular project. So eventually, here and there, he published different things, different little booklets, and then eventually published another book. Actually, could I give this to someone to, like if someone could sit, maybe Father Warren, if you could sit here just to, so I don't have to keep going back and forth with it. Just whenever, once in a while, just gotta press that one, when necessary. No, but go back one. And if you want to sit here or, sure. So the fourth wave of the study, which you see here, again, it was the National Federation of Priests Council in 2001. They commissioned the study. So Dean Hoagie, together with Jackie Wanger, decided to do this. And it was part of this whole thing down at Duke Divinity School, the Pulpit and Pew Research, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about. They give a lot of different grants. And they came up with this book, which if you haven't read, I really do recommend as well, Evolving Visions of Priesthood. And what they discovered during this fourth wave, have any of you ever read this? No one's ever read this. Okay, you did. One or two of you did. Okay. So what they found in that time, which is something like we all kind of knew was happening, but they were able to put hard numbers and statistics on it, was the reality that we do have a polarized presbyterate. We have some priests that are extremely, extremely conservative and some that are extremely, extremely liberal. Whatever terms you want to put, I don't generally like the labels. You can call them progressive, you can call them traditional, conservative, liberal. We kind of all know what the terminology means. But what they found as they were doing this book, that a lot of that aligned with generational attitudes. So you had a lot of the older priests, when they were doing their study in 2001, published in 2003, that it was kind of the older priests, the Vatican II priests, that tended to be a lot more progressive, a lot more liberal, whatever terminology you want to put on it, whereas the newly ordained priests were a lot more conservative, a lot more traditional. And I've been all over the country speaking on this topic, and every diocese I go into, it's always been an issue. And again, I'm presuming here, it's probably been an issue. If it's not an issue now, it might have been in years past, and not such a distant past. In actual fact, I went to one diocese about 2 years ago down south, and to give this very same talk, all about cultivating unity and this research work that we've done. And the timing of it could not have been worse or better, however you want to look at it. But a senior pastor, just the day before I arrived, had literally kicked out of his rectory a newly ordained priest with whom they were locking horns on everything, liturgically, theologically, dress-wise. I mean, you name it, every single thing that had horns on. And I arrived there to speak about unity, and literally the bishop was in this awkward position that he had to correct the pastor for literally kicking the guy out on the street. Get out of the rectory. Get out of this parish. And they were both at fault from what I heard afterwards. The two of them were not the most charitable, very strongly opinionated, but not very charitable. But then anyway, another 8 years go by, and it's now 2009, and FPC wants to fund it again. As I said, they get this anonymous benefactor, this anonymous foundation to foot the bill for this research, and they wanted Dean Hoagie to continue it. But Dean at that time had already just been diagnosed with cancer. Dean was a wonderful researcher. He spent his entire life at Catholic University of America, and he was really the premier researcher in that epoch on the priesthood. And everyone thought he was Catholic. Dean was a Presbyterian. And you would have thought he was a Catholic. All the times you met him, he knew our church inside and out. And I think in a certain sense, he as a researcher really brought a lot to it. But Dean was dying and suggested that we at CARA take over this project. So this is the fifth wave that you see here. So the methodology, I just want to explain this, which I know to me is exciting, but probably to other people it's not as much if you're not a researcher. But what we decided to do is, because it was the fifth wave of the study, we wanted to do a replication. We wanted to ask the same questions that Dean had asked and others had asked. And you're going to see later when I get to some of my future slides how incredibly useful that was to us. And some of the most amazing findings that we had were thanks to the fact that we kept asking the same questions over time. However, you're also going to see the fact, well, the priesthood in 1970 and the priesthood in 2009, right, had changed substantially. You wouldn't have spoken about multicultural ministry back in 1970, right? You wouldn't have spoken about collaboration with lay ecclesial ministers in 1970, right? You wouldn't have spoken about cooperating with international priests. I mean, there was a whole bunch of Irish priests, but we didn't kind of consider them the international priests like we have today from the Philippines, Nigeria, and other countries. So a lot of these topics were there, but the main thing between the fourth wave, which was conducted in 2001, and this fifth wave, the last wave in 2009, was obviously that painful topic that's always there, lurking below the surface for all of us as priests in this era of 2002, the sexual abuse scandal. And we knew if we were to write the fifth wave in this study, we could not put our heads in the sand and pretend that the sexual abuse crisis did not happen. It's two of the most powerful chapters in our book deal with this topic, but we're trying to deal from it from the impact that it had on us as priests. Right? We took for granted that it was a major scandal for the church, that it hurt all of those young children, it hurt their families, it destroyed parishes, blah, 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 blah. All of those things we take for granted, but we didn't want to rehash that. We wanted to look, how did it affect priests? How did it affect the guys who were in the same seminary class with a pedophile, who were in the same assignment with a pedophile, who were the vicar general at the time and reassigned a guy, didn't know that he was a pedophile, and then found out afterwards that he was a pedophile. Then we also interviewed priests who had been falsely accused. And one of the saddest things about this particular book for me is that one guy I had done a lot of interviewing with, and he was falsely accused, and actually I know him very well, eventually exonerated both by the state and by the church and reinstated. At the end, he decided he wouldn't allow me to use his information in the book, which I was deeply saddened by because it was one little part of it that obviously we had to respect his choices there. But that's what we were trying to look at. And I don't know about all of you and how much contact you've had with this whole issue here in Springfield, but I can tell you, the pastor, the church that I just got named at, St. Elizabeth's, we've had 3 priests removed from my parish over the last 30 years. Okay, so, and when I was with the Legionaries, I was in charge of keeping an eye on our pedophile priest. So it's a topic that I've had a lot of exposure to that I would have never wanted ever in my life to have exposure to. And it's something that can often make me cry when I think about it. And the pedophiles I've had to deal with, I've even had to deal with Protestant clergy who have sexually abused children because of my therapist background working with them as well. So it's a very difficult topic, but we decided we didn't want the book to only be about that. So we hid those 2 chapters into the middle of the book because we also knew what was going to happen. As soon as the book was published, where was the media going to go? The papers, the television, whatever. They all were going to hone right into that. And true to form, even though we put it as chapters 5 and 6, true to form, all of the coverage zeroed right in on the sexual abuse thing, which is sad because there's so much more to the book. But anyway, we'll go on from there. Father, thank you. So how did we do it? Obviously, there's so many priests here in the United States. We couldn't sample everyone. But what we decided to do is do a random selection of diocesan priests and religious order priests. It's just the way we do things as sociologists. It's the best way to do it. Randomly select your thing, and that way you can get a high percentage of confidence levels. And we basically, as you can see, we did 3,200 surveys that we mailed out. I don't know if any of you here were one of those recipients or if you participated, but my guess is maybe one of you might, or two of you might have been in part of that. And then our response rate, as you can see, we had almost 1,000 participants, so basically a 30% response rate. You can see the numbers of diocesan priests, religious order priests, which is basically pretty even with what it is in the United States in general. It's basically a 70-30 range there. So we go on to the next one. So once we did that, once we got all of their surveys back, one of the great things at CARA, because of the fact that we're at Georgetown University, we have all of these extremely bright young undergraduate students that have to do their student work studies and stuff like that. So we had them all enter the data, the 1,000 surveys basically, into a program called SPSS. And then we started running different analyses, different crosstabs, looking for things that would be helpful to us to investigate further. And this is actually going to be very similar when I speak about cultivating unity. Whenever we conduct research, you want to do both sides of it. You want to do the quantitative data, but also you want the qualitative data. So what we did is, after we got all of their surveys and we entered them in there and we could start to see patterns that were forming, I then went around the country to have what we call listening sessions. So we chose 2 different dioceses, one up here in the Northeast, the other one was out in the Southwest, and then also I went to the NOCER conference in 2010, I guess it was, 2010, and did an interview with a whole bunch of priests, kind of like Father Warren, who usually comes to those type of things. So we did these listening sessions, and I was really able to gather a lot of really great quotes that reflected very well the data that we'd already received on that national level. And priests were able to share a number of things that I'm going to share with you that are both in the book and in this presentation. Then we also conducted telephone interviews. Most of the telephone interviews had to do with the sexual abuse crisis part. We really wanted to focus in on different guys who were touched in different ways by the sexual abuse crisis. And I can tell you, some of those were the most painful interviews I've ever done in my life, but very, very, very helpful. And then basically, once we gathered all of our data, then we wrote our book. And when I get to speaking about cultivating unity, you'll see that same 3-part structure is what we're going to use with all of you, because I'll also be the priest that will be leading you in this whole cultivating unity project that we'll be doing over the course of the next year. So the overview for my session for today, actually I'm going to pause just for a moment because now I'm going to really get into the material. Do any of you have any questions about anything that I've said up until this point? And can you hear me in the back? You can. All right, if my voice fades off or you can't hear me and you still want to hear me, just, raise your hand, okay? Any questions? Yes?
Was the 30% response you got about what you were expecting, or was that high?
It depends. It was a very healthy response rate. Normally, when you look at like national surveys and stuff, their response rate is much, much lower. When I tell sociologists that I got a 30% response rate, that are studying other topics, they're like, wow. But the book I just finished on the bishops, I don't know, did you participate in our study on the bishops? I sent it out a few months ago. I don't know if you participated, but I got a 72% response rate from the bishop survey among active bishops. The retired bishops, not as much. So, but anyway, because they're retired, right? And you can enjoy life a little bit more rather than answering CARA surveys. But anyway, so 30% is positive. What I usually average when I do cultivating unity surveys, I average right around 69, 70%. And so again, the bishop survey was more like that, but nationally it was quite high. Good? Other questions? Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to divide my presentation today, and I have to say I feel trapped behind this podium, but I guess I have to be here. When I preach, I'm always walking around, and when I teach, I'm always doing that. So it feels a little weird to me here. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about these 3 different areas, and I'm going to pause after each one and give you that possibility to ask questions on them. So know that I'll be taking different breaks. So if you have questions, we should be able to do that. So, is that me? No. So the first part here, we're going to talk about the changes over the last 40 years, or 50 years now, almost at this stage. Then I'm going to look at the current snapshot, right, of priests, and then talking about areas for ongoing formation. So that I'm going to divide into 3. Each of the 3 areas is going to have 4 subpoints. There's basically 12 points that I'll be discussing with you today. Okay, and we are going to take a little break in the middle, so rest assured that I'm not going to bore you to tears. You'll have a little opportunity. So the 4 areas that I'm going to talk about in this first part: changing demographics, graying of the priesthood, internationalization of the priesthood, and the shorter learning curve before the pastorate. My guess is that all of you will identify with everything that I'm saying here. I did a little background research on your diocese, through your own diocesan website, through other resources that I could find, and you're pretty much, as what I can gather, you're going to find yourself pretty much reflected in this. There are different dioceses I've been to where they're not as much, others that are more, but I think you're going to be right in that national type of area. So let's go on to the first one. So the first point of the demographic changes. What you're going to see in this pie chart here is very telling. If you look on the far left, this is the way the Catholic population was distributed in 1950. So pre-Vatican II, you basically had 3/4 of all Catholics were living between the Northeast, 45%, and the Midwest at 30%. So 3/4 of the pie, the blue and the red combined together, 75% of all Catholics in the United States lived basically, you could take from Minneapolis, Chicago, down to Baltimore, Washington, up to Boston, and that kind of triangle of our country, that is where they were. Again, it was the Irish, it was the Italian, it was the French, it was the Germans, it was the Poles, all the different groups that were coming here, and that's where they concentrated. Only 1/4 of the rest of the Catholics lived in the South and in the West, 12% each. At the end of World War I, there was only one Catholic church in the entire city of Atlanta, 1945. One Catholic church. Today, I believe there's 40 or something Catholic churches there in Atlanta, and I'll get back to there. So when you look to the right, what has happened is that the proportionate size has almost now become 1/4. So the Midwest has shrunk from 30% to 22%, the Northeast from 45 to 30%, and both the South and the West have both basically doubled in terms of percentage. So does that make sense? Right? So we go to the next slide. What this means is that there are basically 2 church experiences in the United States today. All of us who are in Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, all of these 2 areas that we discussed, our impression of the church is that it's dying. We're merging parishes, we're closing parishes, we're linking parishes, we're doing all these different things, we're closing schools. In my former deanery there in New Jersey, when we first started, we had 7 parishes at 6 schools. We went from 6 schools to 3 to 2 to 1, and then I had to be the pastor with the others to finally close the last one because we couldn't sustain it, right? So these are the experiences if you live in the Northeast, which can be depressing. It can be depressing for bishops, it's depressing for us as priests, it can be very depressing for our people. In Jersey City, which is one of our bigger cities in our archdiocese, we had 25 parishes. But the people aren't there anymore. They all got educated. They had their kids educated. They all moved up to the suburbs. So the city became empty of Catholics. So we had to close 10 of our parishes. You would have thought, it was just a really, really painful process. We have 15 left. Believe me, we could close another 5 and still be able to serve the people there. But it causes so much angst, it causes so much drama that many bishops don't even want to confront it. Many bishops just want to let it go. I was doing research with Cleveland, I think this was a year or two ago, and they famously had that case where 12 of the parishes that were closed were then reopened because the Vatican overturned the decision of the bishop, right? So there's a lot of this drama. If you're in the Northeast, Midwest, you get this kind of sinking feeling. If you go to the South, or if you go out West, in many dioceses, you can't build churches quickly enough to meet all of the needs. I was doing work for the Diocese of Dallas about maybe 5-6 years ago. The Diocese of Dallas, over the course of 20 years, went from 200,000 Catholics to 1,200,000 Catholics, a 6-fold increase over the span of about 20 years. And do you know how many more priests they had in that 20-year span? 6 more priests to serve 1 million more people. So when I interview priests down in Texas, I remember one priest told me, he goes, yeah, every Sunday I celebrate 7 masses. There's about 1,000 people at each mass. And when I'm here in the Northeast and I ask a priest, to cover for me and say the 3 masses, he's like, no, I don't believe in, trinating. The canon law says you shouldn't binate, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, buddy, go move down to Texas. You're going to be celebrating 7 masses every Sunday, right? That's just the reality that they have. So those places seem like it's a very different church experience, right? Famous case, and you can look it up on the internet. I won't totally bore you with it, but it's the case of a wealthy suburb of Atlanta. It's called Norcross. And in Norcross, the people said, we want to build a new church, but we want to build it like the old Italian style that they built like 100 years ago. And they went to price it. It was going to cost like $30 million. So they're like, yeah, we're wealthy, but we're not that wealthy. So the pastor found in his travels, he found there was a church in Buffalo, New York, that was almost exactly the church they wanted to build architecturally, found a company that would dismantle it stone by stone and rebuild it for basically about $10 million, and they could handle that. So the priest was in agreement, the bishops apparently were in agreement, and they desperately needed to do it, but the town council in Buffalo said, you can't do it. It would ruin our skyline, or whatever they called it. But to me, that case, it's called St. Gabriel's. And to this day, it's a beautiful Italian church that's all shuttered up in Buffalo, just sitting there when they could have desperately used it down in Atlanta for this growing community. Emblematic of what we're talking about. So we go to the next phase. And because, as well, the Catholic population, obviously a lot of stuff that's happening in the South is because of the immigration that's been coming on from Latin America, but also a lot of immigration coming in from Korea and Haiti and other places where Catholicism is strong. In our archdiocese, we've only built 1 new church in the recent past, and we built it for the Koreans. They were able to pull together a tremendous amount of money and build this new church in our archdiocese. And it was the Korean immigrant community that was able to do that. But when we talk more about it, though, one of the things that the Bishops' Conference asked us at CARA to look into, which is, and there's going to be a slide afterwards to show this a little bit more graphically, is that while the Latinos are filling our pews, they're not really filling our pulpits. There's a disproportionate percentages there that we really need a lot more Latino. I was a priest, especially. This is going back a number of years. I was interviewing this, what they call FBI. Do you guys have any FBIs here? Foreign-born Irish. These are all these priests who came over back in the late 60s when Ireland had so many vocations. They were just sending them all across the United States. This priest was like in his late 60s, and his bishop told him, hey, you have to go learn Spanish. You know, we have this whole, and he's like, how am I going to learn Spanish now? You know, and he had this whole like thick brogue, and people could barely understand his English, and now he's going to have to learn Spanish, right, to meet their needs. But it's a huge issue, this multicultural ministry, which again, I'm presuming you have here. Yes, you do, right? Because I know Bishop DeCunha, he used to be one of our priests, one of our auxiliaries, who's now up here, somewhere in Massachusetts here. Fall River, yeah. Because I know he was going there, a lot of Portuguese, he was telling us. So go to the next slide. So that was the first point, was about the, what I just mentioned there was about the changes that were going on demographically. This slide shows you how starkly the priesthood has been changing in terms of just the basic demographic variable of age, right? So what we did, and I contacted the Department of Labor Statistics to get this data. So what I did is I took the average age of active diocesan priests, right, which is the far column, and then we took the general labor force of men, and then doctors and lawyers who have the same basic educational background as priests. And if you look at it, in 1970, doctors, lawyers, and priests, the three columns to the right, were all basically that little bit older than the general workforce, which makes perfect sense, it's logical, et cetera, et cetera. Then you go to 2009, and you see doctors and lawyers around the same time, around the same area, again, a little bit older than the general workforce, but priesthood has skyrocketed tremendously. So go to the next slide. And so by 1990, the median age of the general labor force had increased by 5%, right? Because we know the baby boomers are moving through the population and everything. We found that doctors and lawyers also increased by age by 3 to 5% respectively. But the priesthood, right, had increased by 31%. I can think of no other job, no other sector of the labor force that has changed as much demographically as the priesthood has here in the United States. There's only one other demographic that's worse than us. Anyone want to guess what that one is? Excellent, you all got it, right? The nuns. We've had a 25% decline in priests. They've had a 75 to 80% decline in the same time period, right? Which is totally messing everything up, and hence why we have to close over our Catholic schools and et cetera, et cetera. But this graying of the priesthood, so if you looked at the average age of diocesan priests and religious priests, this is all of them here combined, right? Not just the active ones. You could see in 1970 it was 34 years and 37 years. By the time we did our study, it was basically a 30-year increase across the board of the average age of priests. So hence the graying of the priesthood. If you look at the part down below here, you're also going to see by generation and cohort that we're ordaining guys now at later and later ages. So the group that was ordained before 1964, their average age at ordination was 27. Many of them were ordained at 25 or 26. Now, what we're finding is that the average age is 37 at which we're ordaining guys. So it's 10 years less that the bishop knows he's going to have with each of the priests that he's ordaining, right? And anyway, so that was the bottom part of that frame there. And I don't know if I'm going too quickly, but I'm trying to cover a lot of material. But let's go to the third point, the internationalization of the priesthood. And this part here that we're talking about, 89% of our participants were born here in the United States, 11% were foreign born. We also believe that a lot of them were underrepresented, because at the time we did our study, our understanding was that international priests were about 16%. Their percentage is going higher and higher and higher as many bishops are faced with the challenge. Either I close my parishes, and I mean every bishop is promoting vocations. There's no bishop I know of that's not. They're all promoting vocations, but if you're not getting homegrown vocations, your choices are either close the parishes or import the priest. I mean, that's the only way you're going to do it if you want to keep all of your parishes open. The Diocese of Tyler, Texas, do you know that more than half of their priests are from the country of Ghana? And believe me, I've been to Ghana. Ghana is nothing like Tyler, Texas. And Tyler, Texas has nothing to do with Ghanaian roots. Just that the bishops there were so desperate, the only way they could actually keep that alive was by bringing in all of these priests to meet their needs. And it's a tremendous reality. But thank God, as the bishops in Tyler said to us, if it weren't for the Ghanaian priest, where would we be? Where would we be as a diocese? Where would we be as a presbyterate, right? So this internationalization is a huge thing that the bishops are trying to cover. But we do know now that there are more and more of our seminarians are foreign-born, our ordination classes, I said those percentages are going up. Next one. So this table will show you here, so we divided the group into those that were born in the US, then those born in Europe or Canada, and those born outside of basically Western Europe and the United States. And you can see by generation, pre-Vatican II, Vatican II, post-Vatican II, that 21% in the lower right, represents that's the growing trend. It went from 2% only to 5% to 21%. That number is going to keep increasing as our numbers go forward. So we're going to have more and more international priests than we'll have native-born priests here. And this is the slide I kind of foreshadowed before. So if you look to the one on the left, what you have is that among Catholics at the time when we were collecting this data, 9 years ago, 66% of all Catholics in the United States were white. 30% were Latino. At that time, 92% of our priests, right, were Caucasian, and only 3% were Latinos. So the bishops were obviously very interested in finding out, why is it only 3% here and 30% there? And I could go on and on about that, but we don't have time for that. But it's definitely a major concern going forward. We go to the next one. So this is my last point of this first part. And again, many of you probably lived through this yourself. In my archdiocese, back in the day, like our older retired priests tell me, when you were ordained, you were sent to a parish, there was the pastor, and then there was the parochial vicar 1, 2, 3, 4. You all had a pecking order, and to finally become a pastor, you had to kind of move up through the ranks. One priest of our diocese who just died told me how upset he was, but he was the 4th associate when he was newly ordained, and he was told that his responsibility was to keep the Coke machine filled in the cafeteria of the school. And that was like his mate. He said, I studied all this philosophy, all this theology, and that's what I'm ordained for. But there were so many priests there and so many different things that for most priests, you couldn't become pastor. You had to wait 20, 25, 30 years because there weren't any open pastorates. Right? You had to wait. And therefore, you spent 8 years under one priest, 10 years under the other, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what? That time is collapsing. And it's collapsing drastically. So much so, I was in a diocese, it was either Arizona or New Mexico, where literally they ordained the guy and gave him the keys to the parish. Like, no time to be parochial vicar. 0. Boom. And I heard of another diocese where a guy was ordained and put in charge of 3 parishes day after his ordination. Right? So that shorter learning curve, which was always seen as being an extension of the seminary, is shrinking, and in many places actually disappearing. So that was a concern that we had. So we can go on. And these are just similar numbers. Even as far back as 1993, this bottom paragraph, 39% or 2/5 of the priests had become pastors already in a short period, but by the time we did our study, that number went from 39% up to 62%. So this reality of guys, and I have to say, I was fortunate enough to have 2 different pastors, and this is my second pastorate that I'm in right now, but I so much appreciated being the associate priest. I learned so much, good and bad, from both of the pastors that I had to work with. what I would do myself when I become pastor, or what I definitely would not do. But that was that extension of the seminary, which is obviously falling apart here. I don't know if I want to get into all of this. I think we can skip this because I see we're definitely running shorter on time. So that was my first part. Last 40 years, all these changes. I've been speaking for about 45 minutes now, 45 minutes. I wanted to give a tiny little break because I know we're going till 12 o'clock. I'm going to have to run through this 2 other sessions a little bit more quickly than this. But as I pause here right now, I just want to know, any reactions, any surprises, any questions, or does this all resonate with your experience? Does it resonate? Yeah? Sounds just like you guys, what you've gone through? Okay. Yes?
I just have one question. I mean, this is perfect. Everything is great. Do you have a sense of why this is kind of going down? Like, are you going to be able to answer that in your presentation today? Like why, besides like the obvious value of the culture, it's the graying of the priesthoods happening and the graying of the.
Well, we're just not getting the vocations that we used to. But I will be addressing that in subsequent slides. And believe it or not, there's actually some very good news what I'm about to present to you as well. The working title that we had for our book was Overwhelmed But Happy, American Catholic Priests Today. We wound up changing it with the publisher and everything. But the reality we found, even though priests were fewer in numbers, more of a burden placed on each one of us, we found priests, it's the happiest profession in the United States. The most content, the most satisfied. I'm going to get into some of that data that's very encouraging to that.